American civil religion. Okay, so I'm going to talk about it specifically in terms of the ratification debate because I want to showcase some of the documents that we have available on our website as well. So we'll be using a lot of documents. So you can see I have them printed and in book form. So we're going full nerd for the next 50 minutes. All right, so civil religion. When you talk about civil religion in front of scholars, you immediately get into a discussion you probably did not want. In 1967, Robert Bellah, who's a sociologist, wrote an essay on civil religion in America that really sparked a couple of decades of some very interesting scholarship. I'll put it that way. I think Andrew Manis kind of hit the nail on the head when he said the navel-gazing has been eye-crossingly metaphysical in nature. When talking about what scholars did with civil religion. And mainly what happened was they got in arguments over whether or not it was a real religion. And if it's a real religion, then what is religion? Thus the metaphysical. What is religion? What is this all about? I think that we can be much more pragmatic today. I think it's a very useful way of thinking about religion, particularly in this time period. It is also a really good way to use some of that information from the Colonial Foundation discussion this morning as well in your classroom. And also I think it's a really, for me, a useful framework for thinking about how religion can be taught in a way that is at least somewhat objectively spaced. So we'll talk about that at the end of the presentation today. So there's other ways of phrasing it as well. You'll see in scholarship and in conversation, people will say civic faith, religious nationalism, and then public religion, public piety, public philosophy, public theology. All of these things can kind of come under the umbrella of what I'm talking about when I talk about civil religion. Does anyone here have a preconception of what civil religion is or what you would like it to be? Anything at all? When I say civil religion, does an image come to mind, an example, a story, an argument?
I want to confess, I've never heard that phrase before.
All right. Great. That's actually good. I'm okay with that. So, civil religion. All right. So here are some, I think, useful definitions for what civil religion can be in a very useful framework. So I'm kind of ignoring the really esoteric sociological theories of civil religion that exist. Basically, nation building, right? Constitutes a schema of values which in turn guides decision making. I think this is the most helpful way of looking at it right here. The nation as itself sacred, right? There are beliefs, there are myths, there are symbols that are involved in our nation, right? We have ceremonies, we have rituals, there's days of remembrance and thanksgiving, right? Fast days in the colonial period. I want you to just think about this. If I say this sentence, some people worship America. Makes sense, right? In some way or another, people worship America. And so in many ways, civil religion is a way of thinking about that, right? It's also, I think, a way of getting at the question, was America a Christian nation, right? Sometimes you'll see civil religion being employed by theologians or by historians trying to answer that question. One example would be Greg Boyd, who's a theologian from Minneapolis, in his book, The Myth of an American Nation, about 10 years ago already? Maybe even longer than that ago, might have been 2004. I'm getting old. But he talked about how civil religion is a really useful way of thinking about the impact of religion without it being my faith, my personal faith, right, as an evangelical, because he was writing for an evangelical audience. Andrew Manis, I really like his discussion of the event, so I've got a couple of quotes from him. But civil religion can be best understood as a cultural blending of religion and patriotism that interprets the nation as unique, so that exceptionalism is an important component of civil religion, by virtue of its special relationship with that society's conception. Notice it just says of the sacred, right? It doesn't necessarily mean God or the Christian God, the Jewish God. There's lots of different ways that things are conceptualized as sacred. And we'll see that as we go through some of our documents.
Images does it conjure up? The Pledge of Allegiance is one, and especially with the recent controversy, the national anthem.
Okay. Absolutely, right? Those are some of our kind of, our rituals, our symbols Yeah, John?
On the first anniversary of 9/11, the University Library wanted to commemorate that with a little booklet with the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. And they asked me to write an introduction. And I said, no, I wouldn't do it. Because Steve Lucas, my friend in the School of Journalism, would do a better job. And so I contacted him, the two library folks in the office, and told him about this job and to write this introduction. And he said, yes, he would do it. And so I hung up then and I said, I'm very envious of him doing this. And they said, well, we asked you to do it, why aren't you doing it? I said, well, he'll do a better job than I. It turned out I wrote the afterword, but he wrote in it that the Declaration of Independence was the rhetorical reference to the promise of American freedom, the way that the Statue of Liberty was a visual representation of that concept. Isn't that a wonderful thing?
Right. And it's exactly this kind of thing, right? That these objects, and in many ways these texts that we'll be talking about, they are sacred in some way to this kind of nationalist spirit, right? That's why if you see someone who's not standing up for the Pledge of Allegiance, you have a bit of a reaction to it, right? Whatever reaction you have, you probably have one, right? So,
Maggie?
yeah.
Okay, the dualist part of me, I see this, I see the positive thing, that, John, I really appreciate that, but then I see Nazi Germany as that blending also of that.
Oh yeah, and as you'll see in some of these documents, as you read them, you can get really judgmental of the way that they are portraying America. And that's fine. I don't have a problem with it. Maybe other people in the room will. Civil religion is not necessarily a great thing, and if any of you have read Harry Stout? Harry Stout's Upon the Altar of a Nation? Yeah, it's a phenomenal book. And this is really the Civil War is where civil religion gets the most scholarly attention, because that's where you can really point to two very different versions of civil religion coming to head, right? Like, and it being a bloodbath. And so there's no doubt that this is not a universally positive thing, right? That it is not. Oh, sure. Harry Stout, Upon the Altar of a Nation. Yeah, and it really does cast the Civil War basically as an exercise in civil religion and the conflict that ensues as a result. S-T-O-U-T, that's correct.
There's a book about the southern version post-Civil War called Baptized in Blood.
Yeah, it's also
Southern civil religion.
Yeah, and Andrew Manis in his chapter, I think it's for the Columbia Book of Religion or something, I can't remember the title of the work that he wrote his essay on, he talks about both of those works as being really very key to understanding the Civil War and how civil religion played a component in it. So, yeah. So a few questions that I think are important when thinking about civil religion in any context. And again, this is the kind of framework that you can apply to any time period. This isn't necessarily something that's, let me be careful how I phrase this. It is particularly important to the early republic, because here is where the sacred texts and the sacred symbols and the sacred figures and the heroes and everybody, that's basically where they're at, is the early republic. But civil religion can be identified throughout American history, and sometimes for good, sometimes not so much, and there's different ways that it can be manipulated to be helpful or hurtful. I think that it can be helpful in the classroom if done well. But that's up to you guys. All right, so how does it function, right? How does civil religion actually work? Because it is something that is supposed to be a unifying force, right? It's supposed to be binding together, right? Also to help clarify arguments, identify a common enemy is also a useful way of thinking about when you are identifying sacred texts, you're also identifying what is outside of them, right? And so that can help bind people together and also guide you to what you disagree with. How is it visible? Again, getting back to those symbols, those things that you see that are common amongst you, and you kind of get that that connection. Oftentimes it is an emotional connection. Some will argue that's spiritual. That all depends on your interpretation. What common language does it share? That, for me, is what we'll be focusing on today, because we have documents and we can look at them together and we can talk about the common language and the common symbols that they're using. And also, I think this last question is particularly important because we automatically go towards Protestant Christianity as the tradition that civil religion is drawing from. And that's often true, but it is not the only tradition. And I would say, particularly for this time period, the early Republic, if you are looking for it, the other mythology that is used is significant, right? So if you see the phrase goddess, keep an eye out, right? If you see the kind of philosophical Greek Roman mythology, John can give you long lists of all of these things that are used throughout this. That is also a common tradition that's being drawn from, and it also has this kind of unearthly connection for people, right? And so it's a tradition that's outside of Christianity, but still is kind of making that philosophical sacred connection for people. And so we'll see that in some of the documents. So any questions thus far? Or comments? All right. So there is, again, the colonial legacy of civil religion. The first founders and the city on a hill, this is key. Actually, there's a course being taught this summer, and I had to laugh. I just read the description for it in the break. And the first thing, it's called Political Myths, is the city on the hill, right? That idea that that is what America is. And that has been, from that sermon, came this idea that America is chosen, it is great, it is going to be an example, right? And over and over again in American history, that has been a sacred text that people have gone back to. Again, that covenant theology comes up a lot, and it's not just people who literally believe that their personal salvation is at stake, but there's also just this idea, like if we do well as a country, something will bless us, right? Like there's something out there beyond just economic arguments or political arguments, and especially in this time period when people weren't thinking within those frameworks, they had a very spiritual understanding of how the world worked, right? They wanted that covenant with God, right? And so covenant theology, I didn't mention this morning, it derives from Old Testament covenant, the covenant between God and Israel, right? And so if you're not familiar with that, that's the basis for where this covenant theology is coming from. And you get a lot of references to Israel in documents from this time period. You also get a lot of references to Israel in the prelude to the Civil War as well. So there's that connection in the moving forward. The Jeremiad and the political sermons of the 18th century, we have a link on our website on our religion ratification page to a Liberty Fund book that's really interesting. It's all 18th century sermons that fall within this tradition. And it goes all the way, I think, from 1730 to 1780s maybe. No, I think it goes even past that. Yeah, it might go all the way right till the very end of the 18th century, so past the Revolutionary period. So this is, I'd be careful with, because it's religious people making a political argument, and you can't necessarily say that's the same thing as civil religion. It can be. It's that idea that a minister can actually be making an argument for wider society and a wider adherence, and we'll see this in the documents a bit, and we'll talk about it, how ministers can be calling for something that for them is personal and spiritual, but they're okay with people kind of processing it in a more secular way, right? So think about prayer breakfasts, I think, is a helpful way of thinking about it in the common context. You get a minister who's going to a prayer breakfast, he's like, well, I'm praying to my God. I'm just glad you guys are all here and being reverent, right? So you can kind of have that split goal, I think, and that's somewhat what's going on there. It's a rough analogy. All right, so John already talked about divine involvement in the ratification process, and this is the same quote because it's a significant one from the Federalists, right? This is the same quote? Yeah. So I'm interested in hearing, just as now you have a bit of an introduction into civil religion, how would you read this? Thinking about it not in terms necessarily of Christianity or non-Christianity, but in terms of American exceptionalism and this kind of religious nationalist spirit. What do you see here that stands out? You can participate. You seem excited.
Idolatrous, arrogance, a fantastic sales job. I mean, it's a remarkable quote, but it seems to be at a minimum a little presumptuous to make the speculation that this is the finger of God.
what is he claiming the finger of God did, or the finger of the Almighty?
Helped out at critical stages of the revolution.
So why is hearkening back to the revolution important? What does that do for his audience?
Provides legitimacy.
And how so? Why is the revolution something legitimate?
Birth of our country.
Birth of the country. It's a common experience as well, right?
Good defeating evil.
Exactly. So they immediately have a reaction to this, right? And this is in some of the more prominent historians of civil religion have argued, this is where you get the kind of common mythology developing, which is an important part of civil religion, that you have that common kind of groundwork. So the city of the hill is going to be one of those foundation myths, and also the idea that God was present and active and supportive of the revolution.
How much
But
of
what
it?
he's saying here is the hand of God, the finger of God, was involved in the unanimity in the Constitutional Convention.
Right.
Just as it was in the revolution.
Exactly.
So he's really addressing the unanimity of the convention
Right,
coming up
yeah.
with the Constitution.
Divine involvement in the ratification project is the wider thing here, absolutely. But the important thing that I'm trying to establish here is that he's hearkening back to a common myth, right, or a common foundation story. And if you think about kind of that sacred connection people have, oftentimes it's those common foundation stories that matter, right?
I wonder if this is like Sinai or the Red Sea in an oblique way.
I was going to just mention, wonder how much of it is convincing that part of the population that was not in favor of the revolution to say, see, God was on our side. We're still here. The British aren't. You know, this is a unifying thing. I mean, how many world leaders have used religion as a unifying thing? Let's all get behind the God who birthed our nation and gave these men the ability to create such a document. And
I mean, that could be, I don't know that it's his main goal. I'm somewhat in the vein of thought that John said. It's this idea of, hey, let's ride this revolution train and get my Constitution supported, right? Like, I know people are on board with how we won the revolution, so let's just pull the Constitution into that orbit.
By using the word so frequently implies that we need to be on the lookout for the next finger. And this is that moment, that this is the next finger.
All right, so moving on, Benjamin Rush also mentioned, fairly deduced it from heaven. Again, this kind of, I have a much longer quote from Benjamin Rush. I think I will save that for the end if we have time, because I have a feeling we won't. But this idea that this finger of God, the activity of God in actually writing the Constitution. I do enjoy this. This is what Rush also said in the proceedings on 12 December. He says, I call upon every member of this convention to lay his hand on his heart and to ask himself whether he can, consistent with his duty to his Maker, refuse to assent to the ratification of the proposed Constitution. If there is any man in this assembly who feels a struggle between the inclinations of his constituents and the dictates of his conscience, let him obey the dictates of his conscience. It is the voice of God speaking in his heart. And
So basically, there's no way out.
there's a not for Rush. And so again, he's right. Yeah, he's an interesting folks. So this, I mean, again, that kind of idea that God is involved. You are betraying God if you do not vote for this Constitution. It's not something we hear a lot about. We think about the Constitution as being, all right, well, this doesn't mention God, right? A lot of God happened in the ratification process itself.
Talking about the finger, I couldn't help but think of the other finger. And it's like, if you don't,
Right.
what I'm saying is, if you don't sign this, you're going to hell, right?
Yeah. Oh, yes.
So,
And
there's the finger,
it's
if you don't follow.
That's somewhat what Rush is getting at. I think it's more like you were dragging your country to hell, which might be worse. I'm not sure. As far as civil religion goes, that might be the worst one.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that in the convention, 12 December, the Pennsylvania Convention, Rush continues and says he hopes that the Anti-Federalists will vote for the Constitution. And I will leap across the room and embrace you. Stephen Chambers, a Federalist, fellow Federalist with the Russians, I wouldn't do that. I don't want those damn guys on my side.
Yeah.
Let's continue the debate. You guys keep separate. No unification here.
No hunks here.
That's pretty funny. All right, and then I have an image for you. What do you think of that one?
So that is the hand of God.
Yeah. And all of this, by the way, is directly taken from our website where we talk about divine involvement in the ratification project. So you can find all of this very easy. This was part of the common rhetoric of ratification. This was part of the debate, and it's certainly in the divine involvement of the construction of the Constitution, and then again in it being ratified as we go. This is a quote from our George Washington, right? I enjoy this one. Slightly different. So, thoughts on this? What's going on here? He's no Benjamin Rush.
I just wonder if Providence has hands.
Well, that's one thing that's very interesting. If you look at the word providence in the 17th century, then it absolutely did, because providence was God. It was God's providence. That's the providence you're talking about. There was no question. In the 18th century, providence is not necessarily God's providence. It could actually be this kind of, amorphous thing that maybe is God, maybe isn't, right? Most people, however, are, again, that deistic core is a very influential group of people, and that kind of impulse, that deistic impulse, but not widespread in American society. So providence is still used in the vernacular, but here I'm not entirely sure. I also just like the way he phrases it, that it will demonstrate as visibly the finger of providence as any possible event in the course of human affairs can ever designate it. So if anything was, it's this, right?
I'm also thinking it provides a good cover if it doesn't go your way. Well, we did everything we could. God's will. It's good cover. Not that that applies here.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I've heard it used that way. Have you?
Remember now, this is 5 days before the Virginia Convention meets.
Mhm.
And they're not sure what's going to happen. Now, Washington is of the opinion, if you look at his writings during this time, in the spring of '87 on, he's saying something dramatic must happen. And if it doesn't happen, we might have to have a monarchy here. I might have to leave the army again. And so he's really praying that this thing is going to succeed, so he doesn't have to. Now, at the same time, he realizes, I'm probably going to have to come out of retirement,
Right.
which he doesn't want to do. But he would rather come out of retirement as president than come out of retirement as the commander-in-chief, implementing a new constitution by force.
And one thing too, I think oftentimes in religious literature when people want to use the God's will thing, they're pretty clear about it. Like, but I will be content regardless, right? It's like that kind of appeal of, but God's will be done. Here, this was high stakes because both sides are using this, right? And so if your hand of providence doesn't push the Constitution through, then their hand of providence is the one rejecting it, because anti-federalists are also using this rhetoric.
That kind of goes back to my first question at the start of the day about the common use of vernacular. Is he just saying that for common reference? Because like my sister, everything she posts on Facebook is a blessing. She crosses the street. Oh, it was such a blessing we crossed the street. And so is it really a blessing, or is she just saying that because it's a good way of saying it?
Right, so that gets to, and again, that gets to that question of, okay, is this just rhetoric or is this actually change, right? And I think that's a really important question for us all to consider. I would say that given the level of discussion here and where it goes, there's something else going on. So a couple of other things that I want to bring up. So Fear of Britain in the Americanus, I think is how I would pronounce that. I enjoyed this one. He references that you should be pleasing to the God of nature, right? And it's also lowercase, which I find very interesting. That essay, which is also on our website, talks a lot. That it ends with, Americans, I believe not in the delusive doctrine, or believe not into the delusive doctrine of predestination. The day of grace is not past, for ye have power of reformation. Make your federal head adequate to the requisite purposes of government. Give permanency to your laws. And he goes on and on. He's using very explicit, very religious language on purpose, right? And I would say that in many ways this is a conscious use of a common religious rhetoric to overstate an argument about the importance, and also to kind of play up the fear that people had that if we're not careful, things are going to go badly. We might end up being part of Britain once again. You also have these concerts of prayer. They occurred in several different places. It's not just in New Hampshire. The New Hampshire one, there's also a link here to the Essex Journal, but we don't have a lot of time, so I'll skip that one, because I think that the pamphlet that goes out in October of 1787 for New Hampshire is a very interesting pamphlet. It's about 15 pages long, and it was sent out by the Association of Christian Ministers to the citizens, and it basically, as I have up here, it's saying that we have a righteous cause, right? None but atheists could deny it to be the Lord's doing and to be marvelous. Does anyone have any idea what that righteous cause was?
That's after September 17th.
It is.
So the Constitution.
Close. Not so much. It's going back once again to the Revolution. This is really common when trying to make an argument about the good of the nation and the covenant, because the Revolution was what was covenantal. That's where you signed the covenant with God as a nation, as a new nation. He gave us our country, and we're running it into the dirt. Why is he going to rescue us now? We need to fast. We need to mourn. That's what this pamphlet is saying. So once again, that common, hey, look, we entered into this revolution. That was something with God, right? It was a righteous cause. And then they go through this wonderful list. It's a really fun pamphlet. This wonderful list of all of the things that have gone wrong, including deists and infidels, right? And so they're clearly taking scriptures out. This is a very Christian document in lots of ways. But then they go political, talking about the debt, piracy, that those British won't leave those posts, right? And that's also a failing on our part, a diplomatic failing is what they're saying. The attacks by Native Americans are also God's punishment for us not doing well, right? We're not holding up our end of the bargain. And so basically what they're doing, and they set a time and a date and everything, as was pretty common with fast days and things, that everyone gather together, let's pray, right? Let's together pray for our nation and pray to move forward together. And
meaning, were some groups doing this to say, let's pray for the ratification, or that it gets defeated?
So this is a Federalist document.
Okay.
Too, at the very end of the pamphlet, they have this: all the public teachers of piety and religion are humbly requested to communicate the foregoing concert for prayer to their respective people. It's not Christian language, right? Piety, religion, respective people, prayer, right? There is actually kind of some distancing from the earlier, they don't want the deists necessarily praying about this, and the infidels who they're going to pray to. But there is, in some ways, there is a sort of, I don't want to say ecumenism because it's not quite that powerful, but there is this gesture towards it's beyond just those of us in our own congregations. We want this to be a wider public exercise. And you can certainly read that into the document. You also see that in another Benjamin Rush observation that we'll get to in a minute. Later, New Hampshire also in 29 February 1788, which is that right before or right after the first?
22 February is when they adjourn.
Okay, so it's right after their first convention, before their second convention. So the proclamation of prayer and fasting that comes from President John Sullivan. So this is the quote, and this is from a long fast day proclamation that came out of Congress. But this is the quote that relates to the convention, right? And that's what was reprinted as well in other newspapers. I think Massachusetts reprinted it. Please grant, this is part of the prayer, grant to the members of our convention that wisdom which is necessary to direct and lead them into those measures which may promote the interests and happiness of the United States. And I brought my volume of New Hampshire because I think that reading the proclamation is a very important exercise. I will not read it all to you. I could see on your face that you guys were all super excited. But It's a full page, right? It goes on, and I think there's something to be said about how here, and I don't know if you guys can see that, this is all in caps, but day of general humiliation, fasting, and prayer. Super exciting times. Right? But it is this concept that everyone together, there will be no recreation on this day, right? No recreation. This is a time of reflection. And here, as with other fast days, certain things are being focused on, and here it's the convention that is being focused on. There is an opposing view. Let's see if I can. Oh, come on. This is where my links. I am doing these links on the behest of David, who is our. This does not work. All right, let's see. Hyperlink. Open hyperlink. So exciting. Who really wants us to play up our website. So, first of all, here's where I give my Facebook pitch. All of you should like our Facebook page, because it's actually pretty awesome. Every once in a while, we'll film John saying interesting things. I cut out the stuff that's not interesting, so they're shorter. And so definitely something to keep in mind. Find our Center for the Study of the American Constitution page. It's also a good way to find all this website. We have a lot of, I don't know why I didn't do this morning, so I'm very confused as to why it's not showing my entire. There we go. All right, so we have all of these PDFs on our page that you can link to, and we organize them based on topics. So this is very easy to access. It's basically, I think it's something about like the Constitution and national salvation and national damnation. Those are the two categories. So this is the national damnation category. All right, so here we have a nice little summary. A Baptist criticizes an action, that's the name of the piece, criticizes an action taken by the Philadelphia Baptist Association at its meeting in New York City. So here, there are limits to this, right? There are limits to what some denominations think is proper public action for ministers. So I don't want to argue, and I don't want you to walk away from this thinking that religious people like civil religion because they are themselves religious. It's actually often the opposite. Sometimes religious people are the ones that have the most visceral reaction against civil religion because they're like, no, you're doing it wrong, right? So depending on where you're coming from, that's the case. And so here, I do like that most of the first paragraph is still an endorsement of the Constitution. It's like, you Baptists, stop making this about religion. But it's actually a pretty great document.
So all this stuff is on the website. I don't need to sell my soul to Facebook.
You don't need
Correct.
to sell your soul to Facebook. That is accurate. Absolutely. Yes, no, we do like to put stuff on our webpage.
Later I
so.
can track you through how to get there on the website.
Yeah, it's the reason I'm not doing that is because we're changing it very soon. So I would take you through exactly where to find these, but David's like within a couple of weeks, those pathways are going to be gone. So our web page is under construction. So that's what's happening with that. All right. So also Patrick Henry. I am running out of time, so I will not go through that today. But there are certainly other folks who are not using civil religion necessarily to support the Constitution. These are a collection of quotes I just pulled these directly from our webpage. You do not have to read them. I just want to show you the variety of them here. This is religious rhetoric in the Constitution. John brought up some of these quotes as well. It's very common, right, for them to use this one, heavenly manna, I think is the phrase there. This one here, the third one. The new Constitution, therefore, is cast out of the state to use the strong expression of the prophet as a menstruous cloth. Just think about that one for a couple seconds.
No.
Mm-hmm. So it's not always pleasant, these conversations and how religion is brought in. So here, definitely, you have that Christian rhetoric. This is direct biblical references. But this last one here, I think, that is the tree of life, whose fruit will enthrone the Western Empire high among the nations and raise the firmest and fairest temple to liberty that has ever yet dignified this globe. So here you have, again, tree of life. Yes, that could be a biblical reference. But this connection with the liberty tree and empire, you're starting to get into something that's a little bit more of this secular, sacred space. And you see that kind of rhetoric grow in the 19th century. So still have that component, definitely. The Palladium. Is there anything you want to reference here, John?
Well, I'd say the whole debate over ratification to a great extent is the Constitution the fruition of the revolution, or is it a counter-revolution? And they're looking, often looking at the Declaration of Independence as that foundational document.
Right. Yeah.
And how far does the Constitution encourage the principles, how much is the Constitution overthrowing?
And one thing that I think is very interesting that Catherine Albanese, I think, brought up in her book about civil religion, and I think it's interesting, is that the Declaration of Independence, they weren't as self-aware of how sacred that text would be when they wrote it, right? It had a very practical purpose. It's declaring independence. But in this debate, and in debates and arguments before, it really it was elevated, right? Where when they were writing the Constitution, clearly they had the idea that this is sacred, right? God's helping me write it, right, guys? That's what Madison is saying. And so they were much more self-aware of how important the Constitution was in this kind of civil religion, mythology, kind of foundational way, in a sense that they weren't with the Declaration of Independence. But yet, equally, those are the sacred texts of this time period, if you want to think in reference to sacred texts. Celebrating the Constitution, I do want to show you observations on a celebration. See, that time the link worked, but not for you guys. That's exciting. Worked for me. I will read you what he says about the clergy because I think it's very interesting. He says, the clergy formed a very agreeable part of the procession. They manifested by their attendance their sense of the connection between religion and good government. They amounted to 17 in number. The rabbi of the Jews, locked in the arms of two ministers of the gospel, was a most delightful sight. And then he says, there could not have been a more happy emblem contrived of that section of the new Constitution which opens all its powers and offices alike, not only to every sect of Christians, but to worthy men of every religion. So here, connection between religion and good government, community between ministers, right? They're clearly celebrating something that's very important, but then also the importance of the Constitution as recognizing that there should be a plurality of religion as well. So I find that quote to be particularly interesting. The Manasseh Cutler sermon, I'm running out of time, so I won't be able to go to that one. This one's fun, though. It's on our website, and you guys should take note of that one because it's definitely worth reading. All right, our Liberty Tree. This one I kind of want us to dig through a little bit ourselves because this is where we kind of get to what traditions is it drawing from. I think here is a good example of how we get something beyond just Protestant Christianity being referenced. So this is a federal song, Massachusetts Sentinel. What do you notice?
Are you going to hum the tune for us?
I would, if I could. And I've also scared a couple of toddlers recently by singing, so I'm a little scarred.
There's your goddess. It's idol. Is that idol worship at the end there?
It's a very religious reading. Again, religious, if you're looking at it from the sense of there is a true religion, idolatry, right? But if you're looking at it as, okay, well, this is pulling us together, right?
A little Greek reference.
Yeah, there's definitely Greek references to this. And you see that. You also see that if you want a fun exercise to go through, the debate over the Great Seal is a really good exercise in some ways civic religion because you had some very different people who were part of that discussion early on and then later as it developed over the years. And you have some commentary. I think it was, I can't remember who is who, but Adams wanted a certain Greek myth represented, and then someone else wanted. So it's this discussion of, okay, do we use Greek mythology? Do we use Christian mythology? Like, how do we bring these images in to represent America? And so again, that overemphasis on, in some ways, Enlightenment influence because of who was in the room, but also it matters because that still is our seal today. So interesting. All right, George Washington as Savior. This one is actually pretty common, I would say. This is specifically talking about him joining the federal conventions. This is going back to his support for the Constitution and how vital that was. But I love this because it has suggestions that he flew in, right? He's given this kind of celestial, each caught the flame, celestial powers unite behind him. So this sort of mythology starting to surround Washington before he's even president. Again, also George Whitefield, going back to that kind of like revolutionary civic power of even Allen, by the way, and I didn't mention this morning, became one of those radical deists. So his kind of participation in the religious rite of taking Whitefield's bones for the revolution is particularly interesting in that light as well. And so this kind of activity, ritual, understanding of the heroes of both the revolution and the kind of heroes of the late 18th century as well is part of that myth building as we move forward. So here are just a few things that historians have argued are kind of, and if you think about it, it's like, well, yeah, these are in some ways sacred. It depends on how you want to define the term, but these have a level of importance to Americans that is without this aspect of faith or what is sacred. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense why they're so important, right? But it is part of that patriotism, that patriotic nationalism as blended with religion. The religious nationalism of 19th century historians, as I mentioned this morning as well, it's quite astonishing how blatant they were about the fact that they thought the revolution was directly guided by God. And so that also has a lot to do with why the Declaration and Constitution are regarded the way that they do. As far as the hero worship of a lot of the founding fathers, you can actually go back to Daniel Webster as well as one of the reasons that the civic religion surrounding the founding fathers and their arguments was kind of in some ways deified because he was a very powerful orator and he definitely helped establish that as well. So some historians will argue that this sort of civic religion that I'm talking about, the civil religion, didn't really develop as much until the 19th century, but I think some of these documents here at the ratification debate and the level of the ratification debate show, no, it's there earlier, right? They are helping and participating in this, no, the revolution was a sacred event, and in some ways it helped us form that covenant with God. So I just want to close with a few thoughts that I've had about civil religion as a tool of objective study. And there are some, as I mentioned, historians and theologians who feel that this is an important way to talk about the legacy of religion in America as a way of divorcing it from your personal faith. You can talk about what the legacy of religion is, and it's then not limited just to Christian influence. I don't know how well this concept will translate to middle school and high school students, but certainly in kind of thinking about how the rhetoric is shaped by religion and also other mythology might be a helpful way of bringing it into your classroom. It does absolutely change over time, and if you are interested in this and have time, there's some very fascinating works that have been done, as I mentioned, about the Civil War and also about marginalized groups and how they identified with America and either engaged with this civil religion or reimagined it. African Americans is probably where this literature flourishes the most and the best way, because many of them adapted this sort of religious understanding of their connection to America because of the Exodus, right? And how in many ways they could connect with that religious story of the Exodus in their imaginings of their connection. And also in looking at what the promise of the revolution was and how it held potential for them, and then how everyone screwed it up is also an exercise in civil religion when looking at kind of the narratives of African Americans in the 19th century. So, any questions?